Welcome to Under Investigation, Stories Beyond the Badge. Join a seasoned detective as he steps away from the crime scene and into the lives of fascinating individuals. Through candid interviews and thought-provoking conversations, we explore the stories that shape us, covering personal struggles, triumphs, and the powerful intersections of faith, family, and life. Each episode brings unique perspectives and inspiring insights from people living diverse, authentic lives. Now, let's dive into today's story.
Well, hello everybody. This is Mike, your host, and for the first time, I think I'm running solo with no guests or no co-hosts. Today's going to be a little different. Today's Memorial Day. It's a day that many recognize as the unofficial start of summer. But for those of us in law enforcement and for families who've lost somebody in uniform, it's something completely different. Today, I'm going to talk about 4 people that I crossed paths professionally or personally that are no longer with us. I just want to talk about them and some of their stories that I know about them and kind of see where it goes. This may last 5 minutes. It may last 50 minutes. I have no idea. But for Memorial Day, it's quite a remembrance, a day of reflection, and a day to honor those people who aren't just etched in stone, but they're also etched in our hearts and our minds, both friends and family. But a couple of weeks ago, we observed National Police Week, and that was a time that we set aside as colleagues, as friends, as family, to honor the men and women, that work in law enforcement or worked in law enforcement. It's large groups of people. They gather in Washington, D.C., and you just honor the memory of the people who passed away. There's a ceremony, for instance, that occurs. They honor those law enforcement officers who were killed in the line of duty the previous year. And so far in 2025, I just looked it up a little bit ago, already 25 officers have died in the line of duty in 2025, according to odmp.org, which is the Officer Down Memorial page. And that keeps track of officers who were killed on the line of duty. But the people I'm going to talk about, I have personal connections with. One was a classmate. One was a colleague, a coworker of mine. One simply had an impact on a young family that my wife and I had started at the time. And one was a friend, somebody who I knew personally growing up. So I want to talk about those 4 people. But I want to give a little bit of background on Police Week. Police Week really reminds us that behind every badge, there's a person, whether it's a son or a daughter, a mother, a father, a friend. And Memorial Day gives us a space or a set time to tell their stories and simply to make sure they're never forgotten. So this is my humble attempt to do that. I hope I do them justice by this. But every year, between 150 and 200 officers are killed in the line of duty in the United States. But there's one thing that you don't hear about very often. That's also a quiet killer of law enforcement officers, and that's suicide. Recent statistics show that more officers die by suicide than that are killed in the line of duty. And if you recall, I just mentioned between 150 and 200 law enforcement officers are killed in the line of duty. So take that number and increase it. While those numbers are sobering, it certainly reminds us of the emotional impact that this job can have on law enforcement officers. As I'd mentioned, I want to share 4 specific stories about 4 specific men that I know. These 4 officers served the state of Minnesota with honor, and they gave everything in the name of duty and community. And from everything I know and everything I understand, they did it well. While their lives have ended, I want their stories to live on. So let me talk about the first person that I know. He was a classmate of mine. His name was Harold Hartung. Harold was a great guy. Most of us at Alex Tech, which is where I went to college to get my law enforcement degree, we were all in our, early 20s to mid 20s, and Harold, he was I bet he was in his 30s at the time, mid 30s. We joked and we called him the old man, and he was a quiet guy, but just a great friend that I got to spend 2 years of my college life with. And I got this one story about Harold. Harold lived in like the St. Cloud area. And if you're familiar with Minnesota, there's Alexandria, which is where we were going to college. And then there's, St. Cloud, and then you have the Twin Cities. And St. Cloud is about roughly halfway between Alexandria and the Twin Cities. And there's this one time that I was driving down to the Twin Cities, and I had a 1986 Ford Mustang that the brakes went out on it somewhere between Alexandria and the Twin Cities. And you know what Harold did? He called, or I called, because he was the only one I knew in the St. Cloud area at the time. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm a young kid. I'm, what am I, 20, I suppose, at the time. And I called Harold, and one thing about Harold, he was also kind of a shade tree mechanic. And he's like, no problem. He drives up to where I was at. And he simply takes my vehicle with no brakes, which I kind of look at it in retrospect now was really, really stupid. But he takes my car and leaves me his car. And he says, here, you use my car until I get your car fixed. And he had it, I don't know, I think it was maybe midway through the next week, because of course this was a Friday, because, we're done with school for the week. So we're, everybody's going their separate ways for the weekend. And so Harold had my car from Friday to, I'd say probably Tuesday or Wednesday of the following week. And he fixed it. And he would not take a dime from me. Now, obviously, since then I've learned that doing brakes aren't cheap on a vehicle. And he refused to take any money from me because he knew I was some poor college kid. But you're talking about leaving an impression on a guy, that he went out of his way to help me. And didn't expect a single thing from me. So one thing about Harold was he was one of the silent leaders in our class. If I remember correctly, I think he was our voted upon leader. Each class, they vote for somebody to kind of be the class representative. And I really don't remember what it was called, but we had a term for it at the time. But he was one of those guys. But he was a silent guy, super nice. Everybody loved Harold. And you just knew he was going to be a good cop, just by the way he treated us as his friends. And we did crazy stuff. Again, most of us were in our early 20s. but we'd pull shenanigans. And Harold, boy, he was right there with us. I remember, I remember one time we had a friend. His name was Colin. Colin drove this little tiny car. I remember there was a group of us. And Al, you'll remember this. Al, myself, and several other people. And when I say several, I'm talking maybe 6. We picked up Colin's vehicle, and by the way, Harold was involved in this little prank too. But we picked up Colin's car in the parking lot. It was literally like I can't even remember what it was, like a Dodge Dart or a Geo Prism. No, it was a Geo Prism if I remember correctly. But all of us, including Harold, picked up Colin's vehicle and moved it across the parking lot, and then we put it sideways, and we moved it quite a distance too. But that was great, and Harold was a part of that. So even though Harold was the old man of the group, he certainly knew how to have a good time, and he was just a great guy. Absolutely great guy. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He was one of the first ones to get a job after graduation, which none of us were surprised. He showed up every day, gave it his best. And he was kind of the quiet leader, never ever asked for recognition. That just wasn't him. But also what he didn't ask for is he didn't ask for help. See, Harold had some demons that we didn't know about. And so you could imagine the surprise when I learned that on January 31st of 2000, I had just been a police officer for a couple of years. So January 31st of 2000, Harold took his own life. And Harold was the first cop that I knew in this profession who died. I had a personal connection to him. As a police officer, you hear about line of duty deaths and people dying around the country, right? You hear those statistics. I'd mentioned, 150 to 200 officers a year. But Harold was my first, and unfortunately first of several, that I've known either personally or professionally. And Harold had demons that he just wasn't sure how to deal with. So unfortunately, he took his own life. And I don't know if that's really why I got into the wellness part, with the peer support things that I've done at work over my career, trying to come alongside other officers. But I'll tell you, if you're an officer or a law enforcement officer, even if you're not a law enforcement officer and you're listening to this, reach out. You're not alone. The hardest part is reaching out. There's several resources. 988 is, obviously the newest and the most recent way. You can call 988. You can text 988. But just know that you're not alone. So I haven't seen Harold in 25 plus years. I still think about him because he left an impact personally and professionally. So Harold, I miss you. Yeah, I miss you, buddy. The next person I want to talk about briefly that left an impact on me and my family was Officer Shawn Silvera. For those of You who know of Shawn's story, he was a Lino Lakes police officer who on September 6th of 2005, he faced a moment that would define the full measure of his bravery. What Shawn did was he deployed stop sticks on Interstate 35W here in the state of Minnesota while he was trying to stop a fleeing felon. Shawn was struck and killed intentionally by that person. The pursuit had started up in a county just to the north, and it was coming south into the cities. And so Shawn intercepted and attempted to use stop sticks. But Shawn gave his life protecting others. Why I think of this story specifically is Shawn was married, had two little kids, a little boy, a little girl, and my wife and I just started our family, or actually was just starting our family, I should say. And it resonated with me. I didn't know Shawn personally. I obviously knew the agency, but my wife and I kind of jumped in feet first. We got involved in the Shawn Silvera Memorial Run, which I actually just saw. I think it was last summer. They're still doing it. I should probably go run it again. But our little kiddos, when they were little, they participated in it. But again, I think why the impact was there and why I decided that I want to mention Shawn was that he had such a young family. They're adults now. I mean, I see them every once in a while on social media, because they're still involved in the memorial run and so forth. But I don't know, it just kind of reminds you that life is precious and life can change quickly. And I think it was just that stage in my life where it just impacts you a little differently. Next, I want to talk about conservation officer Ed Peasht. Or more specifically for me, it was Deputy Peasht, because Ed and I used to work together several years ago. While he was working for the same employer I was, Ed was involved in a shooting. And he struck the guy. The guy survived. And I remember pulling a overtime shift at the hospital where this guy was at and just feeling disgusted as I babysat this guy, knowing that he was going to live. Not so much that he was going to live, but surprised that he didn't die. He got shot in the head. And I guess I don't know. I'm assuming he made a full recovery, but who didn't make a full recovery was Ed. So Ed started struggling with what I would say demons. So back then, when this happened, officer wellness and taking care of yourself, that wasn't really a big thing. And quite frankly, in conversations that I had with Ed after the fact, during our shifts, so our shifts overlapped each other and we worked the same area, so we doored up quite a bit. Let's just say the administration wasn't handling it in a way that seemed to support Ed very well. And again, this is 20 plus years ago when this happened. And I just to be very clear, I know the administration there has changed now, and I know they're a lot more supportive. But so Ed was a friend of mine, kept in touch. I moved on to another agency, and so did Ed. And that's why he became a conservation officer. So he left the county and started working for the state. Kept in contact with him throughout the years. I knew he was struggling. I think what was happening was he wasn't able to overcome that trauma that he had experienced going through that shooting. And I'm certainly not trying to throw some diagnosis on him or not. We never really talked about that. But I know when Ed moved on, I believe he worked for, I think, 10 or 11 years. Yeah, very friendly guy. I know he's very well known, very well liked. He just couldn't shake those demons either. And again, I got a phone call right around October of 2018, early October, that Ed also lost his battle to demons and took his own life. It's so strange to me that two people who I knew very personally, that this profession just ate them up. And I certainly, I see the struggles, I see the fights, the traumas that occur in this career. But, when it hits somebody that and they end up losing their life over it, it just sucks. And you wish that you could do more. Maybe that's why I'm doing this podcast, is somehow talk about them and who they were, not focus on what took them from us. But also, I don't want to hide behind the microphone. I don't want to hide behind their stories. Because whenever the topic of suicide comes up, nobody wants to talk about it. Finally, I want to talk about one that really hits home, because this one was a friend, personal friend, family friend. And I want to recognize investigator Steve Sandberg, who I knew since I was a young kid. Steve went into law enforcement a little later in his life. I guess I really don't remember the timeline because I was pretty young as well at that time. But he became a deputy in the local sheriff's office that I resided in the town. And actually, I knew Steve's wife more than I knew Steve, because she was my favorite teacher in school. And so I'm going to respect her privacy and not necessarily bring up her name. But so Steve's wife was a teacher in my law class that I took in high school as I was starting to think about going into law enforcement. And the really cool connection I had there, because I grew up in a pretty small town, the neat connection I had there was every year up until the year that Steve passed away, I would go up and be a guest speaker in her law class. And it was fun. It was a good time. I looked forward to it every year. Um, I'd like to think she looked forward to inviting me. That's why she kept inviting me back. But it was something I loved doing. There were years that I brought my young kids there, just to have a father-daughter trip or a father-son trip. And so I knew the Sandberg family pretty well. And what happened to Steve was he was called in to guard a prisoner, somebody that had been arrested and was in custody. And whenever somebody's in custody, make sure they don't abscond, they send an officer or a deputy to basically guard the room. And that's what had happened. And Steve went down there, and he was at the St. Cloud Hospital. And if I remember correctly, this suspect had been arrested for domestic assault or something something similar. And really, it's a very routine scenario. I mean, I've done it. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I had done it with Ed's case, and I've done it numerous times since then. Pretty routine thing until it's not. So what happened was a suspect, without any warning, attacked Steve in the hospital room. The suspect was able to disarm Steve, from what I understand, and used Steve's own firearm and shot him. So even though he was in a hospital and it happened, hospital staff wasn't able to do anything. So to my surprise, on October 18th of 2015, I got a call. I can tell you exactly where I was at. I was in St. Cloud as well, which is absolutely crazy. I was there for a conference, and I got a call from Steve's wife. And she told me what had happened. I will say the first time she called, it went to my voicemail, and so she actually left me a message. And to this day, I still have that message saved. I won't get into the details of what the message said, but needless to say, I dropped everything I was doing, got a hold of my boss and said, hey, this is what's happening. I need to go. I need to go to my hometown. So I did. So I did the best that I could do to support her over the next days and weeks and months and even years. The interesting thing is Steve was merely months away from retirement. And Steve's wife had just retired. And that's why I wasn't going to that class anymore, because I had finished it. I guess I kind of retired when she retired. And I know that Steve was just a couple of months away from retirement himself. And you're talking about a ripple effect. I saw it from different perspectives. I had the law enforcement perspective that, when an officer or law enforcement officer is killed, especially in the line of duty, there's usually a very public memorial. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of officers that show up to the funeral. But there was also Steve, the one I knew personally, and Steve's wife, who I knew personally. And there just wasn't anything I could do except for be there. So what I'll say about Steve Sandberg is he died a hero. And the silence that he left in his absence is still felt by his coworkers, by his friends, by his family, and even the community. Steve was very well known in the community. And those are my 4 officers who I want to recognize on this Memorial Day. So Harold, Shawn, Ed, Steve, each of you wore a badge, but more importantly, you lived a life full of impact. I thank you for that. I don't think we're going to end the podcast with an outro or anything like that. Just a moment of silence. Thank you.